I don't like to brag about it, but I have to admit I grew up with a pretty tough crowd. Let me give you an example of what I mean. And of course, guys like that produced guys like this.
The only guns with real fanning action. Shoots safe shooting shells and fires greeny stickum caps. This is the gunfighter set with two fanner pistols. The rugged Durahide holster comes in black or brown, single or double. Get 'em
Where?
wherever toys are sold.
What I didn't know when I was that kid's age is how wild our own West was. And we had guys on both sides of the law. And sometimes there was a little bit of crossover. So our county's outlaw years would actually begin 2 years before California even became a state. So we need to go back to the early gold rush. It's December 1848 when a mail carrier arrives at the Presidio in Monterey and delivers this news to the officer in charge. So the discovery of gold on the American River in 1848 generates one of the great internal migrations in American history. The editorial cartoon on the right shows that folks on the East Coast will take any means possible, including those not quite invented, to get to California. The impact on San Francisco was dramatic. This, of course, is Telegraph Hill with Coit Tower today. And here's a less imposing looking Telegraph Hill, but it's starting to crowd up with housing. San Francisco was 1,000 people in 1848. It was 25,000 by the end of 1849. All those hungry miners meant opportunities for rancheros like Arroyo Grande's Francis Branch. Cattle had been traditionally raised for their tallow and for their hides, which drove the New England shoe industry. But now, of course, they were prized for their meat. It's estimated that when Fremont's party went through San Luis Obispo in 1846, they were putting away 10 pounds of beef a day, which I find incredible to believe. They could have wiped out an In-N-Out burger in a matter of seconds. But like Levi Strauss, the rancheros discovered, the money wasn't to be made in panning gold. That was for suckers. The money was to be made in supplying the needs of the gold miners. More evidence of the impact of the gold rush. These are abandoned ships in what was then called Yerba Buena Bay. Of course, the crews have all headed for the gold fields. But they left behind this nice, pleasant, brick-covered saloon and restaurant. It's the Old Ship Saloon, and appropriately it's signed as a dinghy. And by golly, in 2004, while doing some construction work next door, there was the old ship itself. This one didn't carry gold miners. It carried Methodists. They were headed for the gold fields, not to pan gold, but to convert the heathens. And Lord knows the gold fields were running with heathens. Sadly, Arkansas ran aground on Alcatraz. She was towed across the bay and beached. And instead of being brimful of Methodists, the Arkansas became a saloon, so it was brimful of drunks. And then a brothel, so it was brimful of, those people. And then a saloon again. And then it disappeared, only to be found right next door to the place that's named for it. That's relevant to our history because it was ship jumpers from a U.S. Navy ship, a storage ship in San Francisco Bay, who would join with two refugees, two men who had already killed refugees from the gold fields. Altogether, 6 of them would meet up at Mission Soledad and then head south for Mission San Miguel, where there was an inn kept by a young husband and father named William Reed. Well, these characters spent the night with Reed around the fire. He made the mistake of telling them that he had just sold a large herd of sheep, mutton for the miners, and the pouchful of gold dust he'd brought home to San Miguel was so heavy that his 4-year-old son couldn't lift it. Well, the visitors left the next morning, made a U-turn, came back, and murdered Reed, his wife, Vallejo, who was 8 months pregnant, his son, and all the servants, 11 people in all. They then stacked the bodies in the old Mission carpenter shop and tried to set them alight. There's no evidence that they found the gold, but they headed south in a hurry. And the first man to find the Reeds and their servants was the mountain man on the left. This is Medicine Jim Beckworth. In 1848, he was a mail rider, and his route took him from Rancho Napomo, William Dana's place, to the Presidio at Monterey. And it was Beckworth who found the murdered Reeds. Beckworth had a talent for finding dead people. If you saw the film The Revenant, he found the body of Hugh Glass, who'd been killed by the Araucara. He also found the body of Jedediah Smith, who'd been killed by the Comanche. And now he found the Reeds. I have an operating theory that if you see this man riding up your driveway, that's not a good sign. He arrived at the Presidio and blurted out the news to the young officer on duty. Lieutenant, they've killed them all. The lieutenant was William T. Sherman, the future Civil War general. The next people to find the bodies were our neighbors. John Price, the founder of Pismo Beach, the alcalde, kind of a head supervisor of San Luis Obispo County, and his close friend, Francis Branch, the founder of Arroyo Grande. The bodies had not been consumed by the fire that had failed, but Price and Branch found them, sent word south to Napomo, Rancho Napomo, to William Dana that the killers were most likely headed his way. The note that Price sent is preserved in the archives of the Mission Santa Barbara. I found out that they wrote a language I guess you would call Spanglish, a mixture of Spanish and English. Price warned Dana that a güero, a blondie, was headed his way. Probably one of the sailors who deserted. At least 2 of them were Irish. The suspects didn't get all that far. It was a Santa Barbara posse who caught up with him on the beach at what is today Summerland. A gunfight followed. One of the posse members was killed. One of the killers was killed. Another evidently tried to swim to Japan, but was properly ventilated by the posse. He didn't make it. 3 others were taken back to Santa Barbara to stand trial. And they were sentenced to death. The 3 were executed by a firing squad near this spot in Chapala. So next time you're in Santa Barbara, it's about where the California Pizza Kitchen is today. The commander of the firing squad was another young lieutenant from the Presidio, who would someday be a Civil War general like Sherman. He was Lieutenant Edward O.C. Ord, for whom Fort Ord was named. 1848 did not spell the end of violence in San Luis Obispo County in our area. In fact, it was just beginning. One of the most famous outlaws of the 1850s was named Joaquin Murrieta. He was popularized in a novel by a man named John Rollin Bridge, who depicted him as kind of a Robin Hood figure who had been cheated out of his gold claim by güeros, by blondies. This is plausible. It happened a lot. There was tremendous friction between newly arrived Americans and Californios, California natives, as well as immigrants, Sonorans mostly, from Mexico. Racism was rampant in the gold fields, and it sometimes led to violence. That part of Juan Murrieta's story is plausible. The problem is there may have been as many as 5 Joaquins. He was credited, for example, of committing a robbery in San Juan Bautista and in Los Angeles on the same day. And he was not exactly a social outlaw either, I'm sad to say. He tended to rob from everybody and give to Joaquin. He might have had San Luis Obispo connections. We do know that Joaquin and the gang camped out overnight in the Mission Gardens in 1853. Folklore says that his mother lived on Churro Street. I doubt that. But he would have been a familiar figure in our area, with posses periodically turning out to hunt for the famous bandit. In 1853, what passed for a jail was at the end of the Mission Colonnade, and a suspected killer was arrested over the grade and jailed there, and he made a break for it. He hot-footed it for San Luis Mountain with a band of enthusiastic citizens firing their revolvers in hot pursuit. They caught up with the poor fellow, who was hanged from the joist of the jailhouse door that night. The article about the lynching made the front page of the New York Times. Now, when that suspect was running for his life, his route would have taken him across the school grounds of the Immaculate Heart Academy, seen here, founded in 1874, on the site that's now occupied by Mission Prep. In 2004, archaeologists did a dig in the old Immaculate Heart Academy privy, of all places, and in it and nearby, they found all kinds of interesting things, including spent cartridges, which gives me pause. Were the Immaculate Heart Sisters, in fact, nuns with guns? Don't think so, but what's interesting is all the other shell casings are from the early 20th century. The exception is that lead bullet that could have fit this revolver, an 1851 Colt. So part of me has to wonder, was that bullet fired at the fleeing suspect that would be lynched from the jailhouse door that night in 1853. Jack Powers was the alleged head of an outlaw gang that was sometimes headquartered here, to have bought real estate when this photograph was taken. Powers was the son of Irish immigrants, was raised in Hell's Kitchen, New York, came west with a regiment of volunteers from New York to fight in the Mexican War of 1846-48, and stayed in Santa Barbara. And Powers, if I had to cast him, I love old movies, I would pick an Irish-American actor with a similar name, and that would be Tyrone Power, here playing Jesse James. Powers was disgustingly good at everything he did. And the town in which he practiced his charm was not so charming. But Powers was a graceful dancer, so the women of Santa Barbara loved him. Powers, as the Irish do, loved horses, and loved, as the Irish do, to bet on horses, so the men of Santa Barbara loved him. And he was as near a Robin Hood figure as you could find if he only had a smidge more goodness in him. I don't think there was much to be found in that Irish heart of his. His chief lieutenant, his kind of lookout, was another superb horseman, a horsebreaker. On the left there, we think that is Pio Linares, whose father once owned much of the Los Osos Valley. Pio lived in this home above San Luis Obispo High School. It's a handsome place, and in fact, it's still around today. The famous outlaw's home is said to be frequented by Pio Linares. I have, being something of a coward, no intention of finding out whether his ghost lives there still. This is a statistic I was able to find. Now, based on the FBI's Uniform Crime Report, St. Louis was in 2018 the most dangerous city in America. San Luis Obispo County in the 1850s, the homicide rate would have turned out to be 178 per 100,000 population. This was a scary place. Since the county was so tiny in the 1850s, this outlaw gang had enormous power. But finally, they went too far. A rapid succession of murders over the grade. Finally, there was a call for action to get rid of the Powers Linares gang. This, of course, is today's Mission Plaza. This is about 1869. The French Hotel is where a young Chinese immigrant named Louis got his start as a cook. And the building just next to the mission, to the right, was called La Casa Grande. It was built by William Dana, and it doubled as a meeting place and an armory. So if, say, Joaquin Murrieta were spotted in the neighborhood, posses would gather here, arm themselves, and if they'd been of any kind of right mind, they would have ridden in the opposite direction. So Linares was connected to those murders over the grade. The final victim had been a farmer in his field who committed the crime of seeing the outlaws pass on their way north. They killed him on their way back south. This is Sheriff Francisco Castro, who went after Linares and his gang. There was a shootout in the hills above San Luis Obispo, and the outlaw escaped. We went through 5 sheriffs in 6 years until we found Francisco Castro, who remained on the job for 7 years. He was a tough guy. Among other things, he marched into a card room and arrested one of the men suspected in the killings over the grade. Basically hauled him out by the collar, took him back to jail. He conducted the only legal hanging in San Luis Obispo County history. All the other executions either happened at San Quentin when it was completed, or they were, shall we say, extra legal hangings. A convicted killer, Francisco hanged him in the gardens behind the old mission, charged the county $20. And even the way he ended his life 20 years after his time as sheriff, in the front yard of his home on Ontario Road, when he was accosted by a neighbor. A man in a nearby bean field said he heard many bad words being exchanged. Well, the neighbor threw down on Castro, drew his revolver and shot him, and then fell from his horse. Castro fired his revolver, but nothing happened. It misfired. So he leaped onto the man who had shot him and beat him to death with the butt of his pistol. And then he died the next day. Here's his home today. Don't think that Castro had the TV dish. Eventually, law enforcement would temporarily be taken over by the Committee of Vigilance. Daniel Blackburn of Paso Robles in the center, and the real head of the committee would be the publisher of the San Luis Obispo Tribune, a young Englishman, Walter Murray, on the left. Of course, the model for San Luis Obispo's Vigilance Committee was the far more famous San Francisco Vigilance Committee. Dubious record, we hang more people than they did. Here's a partial list. John Price was a judge. Francis Branch contributed $300. You see Walter Murray's name at the top of the list. And then lower down, a young man named John Matlock, whose fate will be tied up with the committees. The theory, Murray wrote an account of the Vigilance Committee, which is rather self-serving, to be honest. He, though, may have had his reasons. This is his tombstone just across from the Elks Lodge in San Luis Obispo on the edge of the cemetery. It shows a man's and woman's hands clasped, words farewell. Murray, in the goldfields, had met a widow, a Chilena. They fell in love, started a family, and here is Murray with one of his daughters. My hunch is that Murray did not want to raise a family in an atmosphere like that propagated by the Powers Linares gang. So the result was cornering Linares on his father's land, what had once been his father's land, near Turry Road in Los Osos. There was a 2-day running gunfight between the Vigilance Committee's posse and the Linares gang. Pio himself was killed with a shot through the head. The young Vigilance Committee member, John Matlock, was also killed in the gun battle. 2 men were brought back to San Luis Obispo to stand trial. They were, of course, found guilty, but they received a reprieve of 24 hours so the town could turn out for John Matlock's funeral. So they were hanged outside the old mission. We think at least 6 were hanged. That does not count extra-legal hangings outside of town. For example, a gang had been hanged earlier, 3 men in Avila Beach. But this is where the Vigilance Committee carried out its sentences. The one missing element was Jack Powers. And they didn't get him. Jack Powers kind of did himself in Nogales on the Arizona border. He got into an argument with another outlaw over a woman, and the other outlaw shot Jack Powers dead. Goodbye, Jack. Now, if the Vigilante Committee disbanded, vigilance episodes of people taking the law into their own hands continued in San Luis Obispo County, including in Arroyo Grande. In 1886, a father and his 15-year-old son were hanged from that railroad trestle, Pacific Coast Railroad, over Arroyo Grande Creek. They were accused of over a long-standing land dispute between the Hemis and a young couple, the Walkers, who lived nearby. The dispute ended when the 15-year-old, Julius, or PJ, walked onto the Walker's property, shot Mr. Walker dead in his garden, shot the family dog dead. Mrs. Walker came screaming out of the house, shot her twice. She eventually would die of the effects of her wound, but not before she'd crawled a mile to the Myrtle place and informed the people there of what had happened. A posse came into Lopez Canyon and arrested Peter and Julius Hemy without incident. And they were brought back to town, where a lynch mob broke into the little jail and hanged the two about 11 o'clock that night from the bridge, which is seen here in this photograph. Unfortunately, the first people to find the bodies were kids on their way to school in the distance on the morning of April 1st, 1886, April Fool's Day. One of the posse members came to talk to the older kids at Branch School. He was closing in on 90. He was Fred Jones, who was the grandson of Francis Branch, Arroyo Grande's founder. And he told the bigger kids that we burst into the jail. The one person we did not expect to be there was there, and it was Mrs. Hemy, the wife and the mother of the 2 men who were about to be hanged. And he said, from the look on her face, she knew exactly what was about to happen. And I will never forget that face. A man named Frank Felix was kind of window shopping in the Sinsheimer store, today's Giuseppe's, when he heard the exciting news that a body had been found. So he hightailed it up Monterey Street to take a look. Well, as it turned out, Frank Felix lived in Lopez Canyon. The victim was a neighbor of his, and the two had been adversaries in another Lopez Canyon feud, which included a case of arson that was blamed on Frank Felix. Well, the guy who was in charge of the investigation was poor Deputy Joseph Eubanks. And I say again because Eubanks and the town constable, Whiteley, had been locked in the pantry of a restaurant by the same lynch mob that had lynched the heavies in 1886. So poor Eubanks, here's another example of trouble in Lopez Canyon that fell in his lap. Well, he did a little investigating, and he found out that Felix and Villa had been arguing in an ironically named saloon called the Olive Branch on Monterey. This is the H&H saloon. Doesn't look too fancy to me. But the argument was reported by a couple of more prostitutes, fallen doves. There were a lot of prostitutes in San Luis Obispo in the 1890s. The primary reason at this particular point in time was the Southern Pacific was approaching town with its railroad workers, so there was plenty of activity, I guess you would say. Well, Felix was accused of the crime. Was unfortunately for Villa was found not guilty, but he couldn't stay out of trouble. This is his booking photo. Now, before we get too depressed, not all outlaws were as cold-blooded as some of the ones we've met. Dick Fellows is my favorite outlaw. This is the San Marcos Pass in 1880, and Fellows would rob this very stagecoach twice near Arroyo Grande the following year, 1881. Fellows was a Kentuckian. He'd read the law, gave it up, started a hog farm in Southern California. Sadly, it was wiped out by a fire. So he turned to the next most logical career, which was robbing stagecoaches. Pulled a job in the San Fernando Valley. In 1870, stepped into the middle of the road, stopped the stagecoach. A passenger leaped out, began firing his revolver at Dick Fellows. Dick Fellows returned fire. In the confusion, the stagecoach driver whipped the team into a gallop and sped away unharmed. The stagecoach was followed by Dick Fellows' horse. So he and the passenger kind of stood staring at each other in the roadway. The passenger shrugged and gave Fellows his revolver. So Dick Fellows had to be content with just robbing him. Caliente, near Bakersfield, was a site for another job 4 years later. This time, Fellows was on horseback. He had found a place of concealment. He heard that the Wells Fargo stage was carrying a large sum of money, so he was bound and determined to stop this stage. Just as the stagecoach approached the ambush spot, Dick Fellows' horse bucked, threw him, and knocked him unconscious. The stage passed unharmed. This was a persistent man. If I didn't get the stage the first time, I'll get it on the way back. What tempted him was he'd found out the stage he'd missed because he was unconscious had $50,000 in its strongbox. This time he chose a new ambush spot with a new horse, stopped the stage. The driver threw down the strongbox. As Fellows was lifting it up to the saddle of his mount, the mount spooked. He dropped the heavy strongbox on his foot. The horse was gone. It was dark. Dick Fellows, cursing and sweating, dragged the strongbox in the dark, fell over a cliff, and broke his leg. Fortunately, it was near a miner's camp. He stole a horse. The horse had just been shod with 3 horseshoes and 1 mule shoe, which made it very, very easy for the Kern County Sheriff to follow Dick Fellows' trail and to put him into prison, where he became the chaplain's assistant and a teacher of Spanish and moral philosophy. He was paroled on good behavior and started robbing stagecoaches again. So evidently, stagecoach robbery is hard habit to break. With me, it would be Reese's Peanut Butter Cups. Fellows resumed robbing stages, including the one near Arroyo Grande twice, before he was finally caught by a Wells Fargo detective. He had made the mistake of stealing that driver's engraved gold watch, which was found in Fellow's pocket. It made it very easy for a Santa Barbara jury to convict him and send him to the new prison at Folsom. Well, he was awaiting transport to Folsom when one day the Santa Barbara deputy brought him his breakfast. The deputy opened the cell door, and not all of our outlaws were locals, just passing through. Last summer, my wife and I watched our niece Becky graduate from the University of Missouri, which is where my father's family is from, so we took a chance on finding my great-great-grandfather. There he is. I'm named for him. His name is James McBride. He was a kind of a small-time Confederate general, but he did fight in the Battle of Lexington, Missouri, on the Missouri River in 1861, and as you can see, they were kind enough to leave behind a souvenir. So we visited Lexington. Well, we decided to stop for lunch at this place called The Heist, which had once been a bank, but on this day we discovered the pure delights of French fried dill pickles. Nellie bar the door, were they good. Well, it was called The Heist because when it had been a bank, it was robbed by the James brothers. Oh, you don't want to drop a history hint like that when you've got a history teacher with his mouth full of deep-fried dill pickles. Because I could tell my own Jesse James story. Because in 1868, when things were getting hot in Missouri, they came out to California and allegedly lived in this cabin on their Uncle Drury James's ranch. Drury would later become a co-founder of the Paso Robles Inn. So Frank and Jesse were playing cowboy for a year to get out from under the heat back in Missouri. They came for another reason. Believe it or not, their dad had been an itinerant minister, had come to the gold fields like the Methodists to convert people and win them away from the path of sin when he contracted a fever and died somewhere in the gold country. So their secondary mission was to find their father's grave, which they never did. Now, Jesse was a superb horseman, but the two of them had never punched cows in their lives. Nobody laughed at them because occasionally Jesse would pull out his Colt Navy revolver and say, pick the eye out of a ground squirrel at 50 yards distance. So they kept quiet. They would go back to Missouri, probably much to the relief of Uncle Drury, and resume their bank robbing days. And wanting to outdo their distant cousins, decided to rob two banks simultaneously in Coffeyville, Kansas. This was the result of an air-conditioned Dalton gang. That's brothers Bob and Grat in the center. When the good citizens of Coffeyville found out what was afoot, they denuded the local hardware stores of arms and ammunition. And that was the end, at least for a while, of the Dalton gang. This grisly scene, of course, would be recaptured with an album by the Eagles called Desperado in the 1970s. Looks like there were more Eagles than there were Daltons. So outlaw days seem to be over until, of course, this happened. But that's another story.